All right, so the Cold War and Revolution in the 1980s, and then taking us through the end of Unit 9.3. 9.4 just really focuses on the financial side, which you can read through. Most of that is hit on here, the big things anyway, and then we're done. Don't forget your checkpoint quiz, which goes over this information. And then today we're going to hit some new leaders. So we're going to have three hardline thinkers that kind of come to the forefront. The Atlantic Alliance is going to revitalize itself in the 1980s under the leadership of Ronald Reagan in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, and Helmut Kohl in Germany. So in the 1980s, we'll really see all three nations believing that the USSR remained a dangerous threat. Remember, basing that off of the 1979 USSR invasion of Afghanistan, the Atlantic Alliance is going to give indirect support to ongoing efforts to liberalize authoritarian communist states in Eastern Europe. So we're still hanging on to that agreement that we will do our best to free nations who and let them self-determine, or I guess the self-determine of if they want to be a democracy or not. So Margaret Thatcher, a little bit about her, became prime minister, only woman prime minister in 1979. She did come to power after a year of bitter strikes, had eroded support for the ruling Socialist Labor Party, and then she's able to kind of come in due to that as a conservative and advocate hardline military positions, just like President Reagan. So we're going to see some very like-minded Germany, United States, and UK in this time. The Falklands War will happen in 1982, and this is really going to give her some popularity. The Argentines call these islands the Maldives, and they think that they stake a claim to it, while the United Kingdom will say it's very much theirs. Argentine forces had invaded and occupied these islands, and Thatcher will send a fleet to retake the islands and will be successful. They're still in control of these islands and gain enormous popularity that will allow her to be reelected as a result. But Helmut Kohl, just really setting the stage on each of these, is going to be distinctly pro-American as well. So we're going to see kind of alliance of the same ideals here. He's conservative. He's a conservative Christian Democrat. And he's going to come to power in 1982, and he's pretty much going to follow whatever the United States and Great Britain do. And then, of course, there's Ronald Reagan of the United States, who's going to take a hardline stance against the Soviets during his first term of his presidency. We had been kind of trying to ease those tensions with previous presidents, but with Reagan, he's going to take a hard line. And Ronald Reagan instead is going to deal with the Soviets from a position of strength, embarking on a massive military buildup. Reagan believed the U.S. could better bear the burden of the expense of this armament, while the Soviets couldn't. So if we push them to create more, we'll crumble their economy, and then therefore show our strength. And I guess it works really. In 10 years, the USSR will be gone. But I mean, did it hurt us too? Look at the position we're in now and the invasion of Afghanistan. We find ourselves kind of in a parallel situation down the road. But anyway, Reagan will also be responsible for Strategic Defense Initiative, the SDI. Star Wars had actually come out in 1976, and in 1983, Reagan announced his intention to pursue a high technology missile defense system like lasers on satellites to shoot missiles down before they could get to us. I think it was more of a smoke screen, kind of like, we're going to do this. Obviously, it hasn't been done yet, but Reagan's dramatic increase in defense spending placed enormous pressures on the Soviet Union, which is what he wanted to have happen. And when the Soviets shoot down a Korean passenger airliner that had accidentally flown over Soviet airspace, so its radar had gotten tangled up, and the Soviets think that it's aggressive plane. They shoot down a Korean airliner. I can't remember how many people died, but Reagan is, I guess, not meaning for maybe, or it wasn't it's supposed to look not purposeful. Let's slip over a microphone. He calls the USSR the evil empire, and this just kind of builds behind him the armament movement of the United States. And then in the USSR, we're going to see where we left off, that there's going to be like lots of old guys who kind of step up to office. but they'll rule for like 6 months and then die because they're really, really old. But the last leader of the USSR is the one we'll focus on the most because it's what the AP exam will call for. The last leader of the Soviet Union is Mikhail Gorbachev, and he is actually, as we spoke about a little bit before, wants to reduce the Cold War tensions. He assumed control of the Soviet Union in 1985. He then, in his 50s, was considerably younger than the communist hardliners that had preceded him. He will put a couple terms into practice that you need to know right here, B, C, and D. Perestroika means restructuring, and he aimed to revive the sagging Soviet economy by adopting many of the free market practices of the West. Glasnost is going to aim to open Soviet society by introducing free speech and some political liberty, while ending party censorship more successfully than Perestroika. But he is like, maybe if I let a little bit of this free market stuff in, then it will ease some tensions, but also let our economy get on our feet then to pursue communism, which just never really works out. He also pursues, he thinks like there's corruption like with alcohol and alcoholism, so a huge anti-alcohol campaign, and then also Demokratia, which began as an attack on corruption in the Communist Party and as an attempt to bring a class of educated experts into decision making. But all of this is just not going to work. March 1989 is going to be a key date, more so a key year, really, if you look at all the things that are going to happen in 1989. But the first free elections will be held in 1917. Gorbachev had sought to reduce the East-West tensions, and in doing so withdrew Soviet troops from Afghanistan, encouraged reform movements in Poland and Hungary, repudiated the Brezhnev Doctrine by pledging to respect political choices of peoples of Eastern Europe. So kind of undoing some of these things that had caused massive tension. He will have the INF Treaty that he will sign with Reagan in Washington, D.C. of 1987. This is a milestone because all intermediate range nuclear missiles from Europe will be banned, and it represented a major milestone in the reduction of Cold War tensions between the U.S. and the USSR. Cutbacks in the START 1 Treaty will be signed in 1990 between Gorbachev and President George Bush, and that would cut 10% of U.S. nuclear weapons and 25% of Soviet nukes and limit ICBM warheads. So we see that this just continues in the easing of the tensions of the Cold War. And then because of the releasing of some of this communist control, the areas around around the USSR will also want to end communist control. And so Eastern Europe will be impacted, and we'll get the revolutions of 1989. So again, 1989, a key year, not just date. And part of the reason that this will happen is because the cost of maintaining satellite countries for the USSR, both politically and economically, were too much of a burden for the Soviets to handle. And so we'll start to see these places like Poland and that solidarity movement that we saw started by Lech Walesa, who we'll see return. Remember, we talked about in 1979, the Pope had started the chain of events that it will end communism as preaching inalienable rights. He had been a Pole himself, and so had been preaching that. And so this will continue or pick back up after it had been made illegal. It'll be legalized again, and free elections will be promised in June of 1989. And this is where they will get their first non-communist leader in Eastern Europe since the Stalin era. It triggered a wave of freedom movements in Eastern Europe. So we always talked about, Europe caught a cold from France. Now Europe's catching a cold from Poland. Poland will start this wave of freedom, and Lech Walesa will become president in 1990, but later we'll see it break into factions, but really you just need to know it's back. It's going to start in Poland and spread out to Hungary. On October 23rd, the Hungarian leaders are going to proclaim an independent republic, and a coalition government's going to emerge. Because this happens, and Hungary is right on the border of East Germany, we're going to see that 350,000 East Germans are going to vote with their feet and leave East Germany by 1989. There'll be tons of demonstrations. It will be the end of the police state in East Germany, and there's really no choice at this point but to tear down the wall, so this freedom movement will trickle into Germany. And there's the famous Reagan quote of Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And so on the border of East Germany, Germany will be reunified in 1990. Conservative Liberal Alliance for Germany is going to tie to West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl's Christian Democrats. And in July of 1990, East and West German economies will merge. Soviets are going to oppose unified Germany and NATO, but eventually will have to give in when West Germany provided massive economic aid, not only to East Germany, but to the Soviet Union. These freedom movements will keep spreading, and that takes us into Czechoslovakia with the Velvet Revolution in December of 1989. Remember, Czechoslovakia had been created at the end of World War I, so had not had any of these freedoms, and the fall of the Berlin Wall will inspire reformers to break away from Soviet influence. A general strike results in the fall of the communist government, and the Václav Havel, who's a dissident playwright who had been writing plays like you know, poking at communism, will become the president of Czechoslovakia. And in 1993, the Czech Republic and Slovakia will split into two different countries because of the ethnic differences between the Czechs and the Slovaks, precluded a stable unified state, so they'll see that they're much better off broken in half. It will spread to Bulgaria, this freedom movement, in November of 1989, and although they did not have an organized reform movement like Poland and Czechoslovakia, a day after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Bulgarian Politburo will demand that its leader resign and purge Stalinists and encourage its estranged ethnic Turks to return to the country for this movement. And that leads us into the freedom movement coming into Romania, which is an exception, and AP Euro loves exceptions. All of these freedom movements have been peaceful except for Romania. Romania has an oppressive dictator in place. His name is Nicolae Sejau, and he is really their come out as a leader to challenge these people who are trying to overthrow the government. And he'll be shot at and then flee and then caught and assassinated. And there's actually a clip of him being assassinated you can find on YouTube. But he'll be assassinated in December of 1989, and about 1,000 people die as a result of the revolution. So it's the only one that didn't happen peacefully. And then this will spread into Albania in 1990, Europe's poorest country, and it was inspired by the overthrow of Ceausescu in 1989. And demonstrations will plague the government for over a year, but the communist government will fall in June of 1991. All right, so if I had to sum up the long-term causes of the fall of the Soviet Union, really the cost in protecting and maintaining this large communist empire in Eastern Europe was just too high. Plus the pressure put on by the United States and the armament race, it just will break the economy. The call for reforms from the burgeoning middle class became increasingly influential in the 1970s and 1980s, and the general economic crisis in Europe during the 1970s, spurred by the oil crisis, laid the foundation for the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s. Also, the nationalist resentment of the Soviet government grew among many Soviet republics, especially those who didn't feel represented nationally, ethnically, especially the Baltic republics of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, eventually leading to the empire's downfall. The economy will continue to lag since the 1960s, even with Gorbachev's perestroika policies that sought to reform it. Increased shortages will continue to frustrate the Russian people. And then, of course, we said time and time again, the 9-year war in Afghanistan was a financial, military, psychological, and resource drain on an already weakened USSR. So really bad move on their part. And the Soviets retreated in 1988 in the face of a strong resistance. So, short-term cause. The coup in Moscow is going to be our short-term cause in 1991, piled on top of all of these long-term causes. So the coup in Moscow is going to be caused by communist hardliners frustrated with loss of Soviet power and prestige after the revolutions of 1989, are going to attempt to overthrow Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. And the coup will actually fail when the military refuse to crush popular resistance. Boris Yeltsin, a name that you're going to become more familiar with as you read through the rest of this packet, the president of Russia, so not the Soviet Union, but the president of Russia, 1991 to 2000, defied Soviet tanks and became a national hero. He's actually going to defend Gorbachev, but the coup, although not successful, will fatally weaken Gorbachev and spell doom for the Soviet Union. So that's your short-term cause. there, because Yeltsin and his liberal allies will declare Russia independent after this and withdraw from the Soviet Union, and all of the other republics will follow. So on December 25th of 1991, the Soviet Union will dissolve into 15 separate republics, and the republics will remain economically connected, however, for a few years. You can't just jump out on your own after this massive expanse of time together, via the Commonwealth of Independent States, or the CIS. But Russia will assume the Soviet Union's seat in the United Nations Security Council. And this is where we're going to see some post 1991 challenges in Central and Eastern Europe, as the USSR, the Soviet Union, breaks apart. How do they transition? And so what you need to really just know here is President Boris Yeltsin's government is going to fail to significantly improve the Russian economy, which is going to make this transition very difficult. There'll be a 1998 financial crisis, which will almost collapse the Russian banking system. We'll see oil production being heavy in reliance, and political changes are going to prove difficult. I mean, we had czars and then communist totalitarian. I mean, we just really haven't tried out this democratic government thing. And Yeltsin really just tried to do too much simultaneously instead of focusing on a couple big changes, or even one. He will also get embroiled in a power struggle with conservative parliament. There'll be the war in Chechnya, which is one of the biggest issues of the 1990s and early 2000s. And then we'll see Yeltsin is going to have to resign due to his poor health and lack of popularity. It's also said that he was probably possibly a big alcoholic, which might have something to do with his health, but you know. Vladimir Putin then will come to the stage. Of course, we know he's going to come back on stage 2000 to 2008, and begin gradually re-centralizing power. And we'll start to restrict the press again. We'll put some economic reforms in that were somewhat successful. But Putin's role in stabilizing the Russian economy, his crackdown on Chechen rebels, resulted in his overwhelming re-election in 2004 with 71.3% of the vote. After terming out of office, he will serve as prime minister until 2012, and then when we know in May of 2012, Putin will begin his third term as president. There will be a little interim there with Dmitry Medvedev to presidency in 2008, which will be just a short interim there. Foreign policy, you can kind of read through there. Main thing you need to know, the East and Eastern Europe, the shift to a market economy was difficult. There were no precedents that existed to guide the transition. Economic activity will be one of the biggest downfalls. Unemployment, inflation, large deficits, all of that standing in the way. And then Eastern Europe's integration into Europe, going to be here and there. NATO is going to welcome former Eastern Bloc countries. 1999, Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary. 2004, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, and Bulgaria. And then the European Union in 2004 will let in the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And so that's just really running through there. Most of this you're probably pretty familiar with from U.S., but just a little more of a European slant. And then that brings us to nationalism since World War II. One of the main causes of World War I, and we followed it through World War I into World War II, and its cause of World War II. Now kind of seeing the decolonization of the world. European powers experienced the disintegration of their colonial empires after World War II. It becomes a nasty word, this colonization or these empires. Almost every territory will gain independence on this new stance of self-determination. Modern nationalism and the belief in self-determination and racial equality spread from intellectuals to the masses in virtually every colonial territory after World War II. There's going to be a decline of European prestige that happens as a result of World War II. And after 1945, European powers were more concerned about rebuilding Europe. Thus, their colonies became less of a priority, and actually they needed it to be less of a hindrance economically. Asia, India played a key role in decolonization and decline of imperialism with the Indian National Congress. You've had Mohandas Gandhi, passive resistance, Jawaharlal Nehru, Clement Attlee, Lord Louis Mountbatten. You need to know all of these involved with the decolonization and decline of imperialism in India. Vietnam, of course, after Japan was removed after World War II, the French tried to reassert control of Indochina. The Ho Chi Minh led the independence movement in the north. We know the Vietnam War history. In 1954, defeated French forces at Dien Bien Phu. Vietnam was divided in north, communist, and south, pro-Western. This is an issue that continues today, a civil war resulting. The U.S. was eventually defeated in its attempt to kind of an overtime there, in its attempt to prevent the communist takeover of South Vietnam. And Vietnam was unified in 1975 and free of Western influence. Arab nationalism, the Balfour Declaration in 1917 indicated Britain favored creation of the Jewish national home in Palestine, and Great Britain announced its withdrawal from Palestine in 1948. In Africa, we'll see that Egypt, there'll be an Arab defeat in 1948 by Israel, triggered a successful nationalist revolution in Egypt in 1952. A lot of these things are like when they rewrite the test here in a couple years, you'll see all of this mentioned in much broader strokes, connecting to some modern events here. Um, Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal as the last symbol and substance of Western power in the Middle East. Algeria in the mid 1950s. If you've seen the Battle of Algiers, there's going to be a battle war between French and Algerian nationalists. Charles de Gaulle, who had returned to power, um, is going to accept principle of Algerian self-determination. And in 1962, after more than a century of French rule, Algeria will become independent, and the European population will quickly flee. Crisis led to all of the French Fourth Republic and beginning of the Fifth Republic. So you need to know the Fifth Republic in France will start as a Battle of Algiers as the conflict in Algeria. But know that they get their independence. Sub-Saharan Africa, the British Commonwealth of Nations. In 1957, with Ghana, Britain's colonies achieved independence with little or no bloodshed. Loose association. Cultural imperialism, however, is going to continue, is something that you might note there, be asked on the AP Euro exam. Eastern Europe and Russia during the Cold War, we talked about above. Revolts against Soviet influence. So we covered East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland. So that's also considered like a decolonization, but we covered all of those in the context of Russia and USSR. There will be a civil war in Yugoslavia, and in response, as we discussed, Croatia and Slovenia were declared independent, and Bosnia-Herzegovina will declare its independence. So we really just have the making of the world's modern map coming together here. Of course, with this, we know that there will be some huge crisis. There'll be some ethnic cleansing. The Bosnian Serbs will try to liquidate or remove Muslims. We'll see the Kosovo crisis in 1999. And then nationalism in Western Europe, the unification of Germany that we talked about. The IRA, the Irish Republican Army, will terrorize English cities. So we'll see some nationalism movements that still, play some roles today. And that you can kind of read through. So it's just a real overview of the modern. The things that you may be asked are terms from here. But really just following up into 1989 as a big key date. And make sure that you read through the economic packet, but really cover the grit, the meat here, as quickly as possible. It has a smaller percentage chance of being on the exam, but you still do need to be prepared with some of the information because where it will land is probably in a free response portion. Being able to identify and analyze factors that were responsible for the onset of the Cold War as a result of World War II and the tensions that built there, you've got that. Analyze the ways in which the Soviet Union was able to maintain control of the Eastern Bloc nations between 1945 and 1988. You will, the Brezhnev, all of that, you can nail that, be able to make 2 paragraphs easy. The decline of communism and Soviet influence, 1968 to 1989. You have the revolutions. You're going to have the actions of the United States, economic problems. You can get all of that. Identify and analyze long-term causes for the fall of the Soviet Union. You have a great list there. Be able to name drop any of that. Western liberalism won the Cold War. Assess the validity of this statement. You should be able to talk about Western liberalism and how that impacted the Cold War and the end of the USSR. Identify and analyze factors that led to the decolonization of Europe's empires in Africa and Asia that we just covered. You would just want to be able, to say that we were putting away um, the racial inequalities that have been set up, and that really it's going to spread with the fact that we are racially equal, and modern nationalism, self-determination, all of those things, so you can nail that. Analyze the ways in which nationalism played a major role in European affairs between 1945 and 2001. You could pick from tons of stuff there that we've covered, and the roles that nationalism played, and to what extent was nationalism the dominant force in Eastern Europe between 1989 and 2001. You could pick any of those countries that took those freedom movements, and talk about that. So you have everything you need in here. Don't forget about the quiz, still open till Tuesday, or if you need for me to reopen it for you. But that is it. Congratulations, you have covered all of European history from the Black Death. It's been quite a trip. Thank you for letting me take it with you. And I will see you in class to check in on your videos on Tuesday.